Welcome to Native Exiles, the podcast where we talk about following Jesus in the tension of being in the world but not of it. And this is episode number 1. So thanks for joining us on this. If you are following us from before, the First Look podcast, this is the new name, the new brand, and we're excited for this new season together. We got a little bit of a different format. Pastor Steve Brooks is going to join us. We're going to be releasing podcasts every other week, and we're going to just be talking about some of the big things going on in our church, what we're learning from the scriptures, what we're talking about, where God is leading us, and grateful that you're with us. We're going to have a conversation starting today about what we learned from COVID as a church, and we're going to do a couple episodes on this, but just kind of looking backwards and looking ahead at the same time. What God has showed us, where he's leading us, what's important, and how COVID revealed some of that stuff. So Steve and I have got a great conversation for you in store today. Let's listen in. Steve, so good to be here with you for episode number 1 of Native Exiles.
This is exciting, man. We're here.
Yeah, so for those who haven't been caught up on the change of title, change of everything, Steve Brooks is our new co-host for the podcast and will be with us every week, which I'm really excited for. So thanks for being a part of it.
Happy to be a part of it.
So episode number 1, and this whole podcast, the idea is trying to help people follow Jesus as both natives of our culture, of our country. We, for those of us that were born here, we were born here. We're used to this place, and yet at the same time, we're called to be exiles. We're called to be people whose real citizenship is in heaven, following Jesus. So living in the midst of those two things, the tension there. And as we were thinking about where we've seen that in our church, really recently, one of the big things I think is navigating together what church looks like now in 2021, soon to be 2022, after COVID, post-COVID church.
It's been a million different iterations, right? Are we here? Or are we not here? Do we have masks on? Do we sing with masks, without masks? It's been crazy.
And it seems like in the church world, if you talk to people about, what has changed after COVID, everybody's pretty sure they know, and everybody's different. It's like, it's going to change everything. It's going to change nothing. Nobody's going to come to church ever again because of COVID.
We've been all over the map.
This COVID has fast forwarded America 20 years into Europe. So have you heard that one before?
No.
I've heard, COVID fast forwarded America. So normal is now going to be like what England is like. It's like, well, I haven't heard any accents. Not sure we're going to become England.
I have some insensitive remarks I could make, but I'll hold off.
So, but here we are. We're making fun of everybody doing that, but it's time for us to talk about that a little bit. And just kind of put it in the context of our church, we're launching things in this new year, this fall. And as leadership, we're thinking and praying about what our church needed this year. It was pretty clear, I think, that our people needed to get reconnected. That when we looked at the state of our church after COVID, people were starting to come back to church. And a lot of people had connections. They had relationships that had maintained all the way through. But we also saw this huge influx of people, some people coming back to Alderwood, some people at Alderwood for the first time, who were ready to be back at church. They had a spiritual longing. They know they needed the habits of following Jesus in their life. They know they needed the church, but they just, at this point, weren't deeply connected to our church anymore. Our life group attendance was way down from what it was before. Some of our other ministries hadn't even been happening. And so our huge push this fall was get connected. Find out how you can become a part of our family again. And that, I think, is coming from an idea that we have about what the church is, informed kind of from COVID, and seeing that the church isn't what Jesus wants us to be if all we are people who watch our services online or whatever, So I kind of want to help people see how we're getting there, and maybe we can go back in time a little bit to think about how we've learned from COVID, what we saw in the church going through that experience. And let's go back to the beginning, Steve. What do you remember about the early days when things really shut down and we had to start navigating this together?
I was just thinking about it, and this isn't that long ago, right? We're talking about like a year ago. I remember sitting in the living room with my 2 teenage daughters, and the biggest question on everybody's mind was, should we sing out loud? I really don't want to sing. Dad, why are you singing out loud? Just the awkwardness of doing church in our living room. let's get to the sermon so we don't have to feel awkward.
There's two things that for some weird sociological reason everybody experiences. One is that for whatever reason, you don't sing when you're watching church on television. The second one is that you don't close your eyes when somebody's praying. Somebody starts praying on the screen and you just stare at them. And I don't know what's going on there in our brains, but yeah, so there's a little bit of an awkward transition and this was back when we had to be online, right?
Yep.
Things were just shut down. Almost every church. I mean, I really don't know an exception. Every church was shut down, and we, scrambled to try to figure out how to continue to minister to people, how to, get our teaching online, how to get our worship online, how to continue to engage with our people digitally, which is hard. Life groups weren't meeting. No ministries were happening in person. I kind of missed actually most of the craziness. I was in the Cook Islands. I just happened to be my sabbatical.
Thanks for reminding me of that.
Which was nuts. I mean, I flew on a plane to the Cook Islands on February 28th. And 1 week later, the entire world had changed, like it was crazy. And it was so weird being there, hearing what was happening back home and having absolutely no context for it, whatever, because really nothing changed at the Cook Islands.
Yeah.
Like everybody's just still on the island.
It was still 85 degrees every day. Yeah.
And it wasn't that way forever because we didn't get the craziness of our flights getting canceled. I got stuck there for an extra 5 weeks. I was in the Cook Islands for 9 weeks. But in the early days, hearing the news, did you know that Alderwood closed? Being at the Cook Islands, it felt to me like the biggest overreaction I had ever heard. I was like, I cannot believe that people are losing their minds over this silly little virus. And I know some people still feel that way, but I just didn't have a concept of the magnitude of what was happening back here.
It was so weird to go through. It was surreal.
So do you remember back in the early days when church was online, your initial reaction to the change of pace? I mean, you're a pastor. You're used to long days on Sundays, but for any Christian that was just used to going to church, you're used to a certain rhythm. Do you remember how you felt about the change when Sunday you could stay home, when you're ready, turn on the service with your family?
True confessions.
Yeah.
It was kind of nice to be able to sleep in until 10 o'clock or whenever I wanted to sleep in. I do have to say, all respect to Bill Martin, who made the coffee last week, your dad. I make a better cup of coffee at home.
Oh, come on.
I mean, I enjoyed my coffee, sat there in my sweats. It was kind of nice. The first couple months, I really loved that.
Yeah.
And then?
Well, so I had the exact same experience. I was just 2 months delayed. So, we're in the Cook Islands for 9 weeks. We finally get home the first week of May. And we get home, and I mean, everybody in our entire life is just bemoaning the state of the world. I mean, just complaining about everything. That the kids are home, they're losing their mind. I mean, these are when all the memes are going on about like moms, filling their coffee cups up with wine just to get through the day. And I mean, just like all the people were just done. I've been in the Cook Islands for 9 weeks. I'm doing pretty good.
You weren't feeling it.
I get back and I get to experience this new shutdown life for the first time. And so for the first, couple of Sundays, church is at home. We sleep in. May, the weather started to turn around a little bit. At some point, we grab our iPad, make our cups of coffee, head out to our deck where we're on our outdoor furniture and, watching the service as the sun is, coming up over the hillside. And I was like,
brutal.
I could get used to this, This isn't so bad. And I know I shouldn't feel that way because I'm a pastor, but I'm like, man, I could live this way.
I could get used to this.
Yeah. And what happened with that? I mean, it's not like I completely changed my mind from there where I didn't see any value whatsoever in the convenience, but I feel like that only lasted for so long. I don't know if you experienced that too.
Very much. I mean, it was interesting. Like a couple of months in, I just remember feeling like I really missed people. I miss being able to shake hands with people on Sunday morning. I miss playing with their kids in the lobby.
Yeah.
I just miss being with people. But it took a while. That wasn't the initial reaction.
Yep. And that I think is where, as the leaders of the church and also just as Christians, we had to start really wrestling with this idea of what is church. what does it mean to be committed to a church? What does it mean to obey the scriptures when it comes to gathering in a church? And this is where churches have to start wrestling with when they come back in person, to what degree they come back in person. Is it okay to keep on delaying coming back, or is that a violation? And there's probably one passage that was thrown around more than any other in this when we think about what the Bible asks of us. And Steve, why don't you share that with us?
Yeah, from Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Very well-known verse. Not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, like Wyatt in the Cook Islands, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching.
Yeah. And I think this is a really meaningful verse, especially for this discussion. And yet I think it's kind of easy to just throw it out as a quote, like, hey, don't give up meeting together.
Right.
We know that that's it. As if that kind of solves all problems or like any argument, where there are competing biblical values at play. Week 1 of the shutdown, I don't think anybody was throwing that verse around. When there's like an emerging pandemic, nobody knows at that point how deadly it is, right? Nobody knows how infectious it is.
How long it's going to last.
Yep. I mean, remember the early days? How long were we shut down for?
A month, right?
First, I think it was 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It's only going to be 2 weeks. Then we'll be back. Then it was like, it might be a month. You're right. And then like 18 months later, here we are still talking about COVID. But that first Sunday, hardly anybody was saying, Hebrews 10 really does say we shouldn't give up gathering. So this 1 week to protect the health of our church and our community is not okay. We were all okay with that, but it's this gray area of at what point does the value of meeting together in person and encouraging one another, does that start to trump some of the health benefits, all that of protecting people from a pandemic,
Yeah, that's a great question, because there was that aspect to it, the obeying the governing authorities, loving our neighbor, but there was also the me sitting there in my sweats and drinking my good coffee. Like I ran in Hawaii 5 months ago to a bunch of Google employees on the beach, and they're for the rest of their life going to work from Hawaii.
Right.
So why would they change that? They love life. So we started asking similar questions in the church. Like, hey, wait a minute, maybe we could do this thing.
Maybe this is it. Maybe streaming the service.
Yeah.
Is gathering together.
Get
with
the
God's
best of
people.
both worlds.
And I'll be honest, I'm pretty sympathetic to that. Like, I think that how we do church is typically not prescribed by the scriptures. Why we do church, to worship, to follow Jesus, to read the scriptures, to study them together. But what it specifically looks like, we almost get none of that in the scriptures. And it's for good reason. I think God knows that church is going to thrive in different centuries, different cultures, different contexts. So we just never got the divine service flow that, church looks like 10 minutes of worship followed by 20 minutes of teaching, followed by everybody
Lord's Supper every week,
shaking each other's hands. There's nothing like that in the scriptures. Yeah. So I'm sympathetic to the kind of thinking, which is that, okay, in our culture, in our day and age, with our technology, what does church look like? Could it be digital? Could it be through a screen? I don't think that's a wrong question to ask. But I do think we realize that it isn't going to cut it right now.
Well, I think the tension there is, you're right. A lot of things have a lot of latitude. How much you worship, how long you worship, what kind of worship, how long, all sermons, all that kind of stuff. But the question we really started asking ourselves was, do we have to be in person for this to be the church?
Right.
And I couldn't get away from this idea, and we preach it all the time. The church isn't a building. It means literally in the Greek, the called out ones. And, if you look at it, actually, it's not a church Bible word. They used it every day. It meant an assembly, a gathering.
Yeah.
So I feel
you're
more
defining
and more
the Greek word ecclesia, right? Which is translated church in our English translations. It means the called out ones.
The called out ones, but in everyday language, it meant an assembly or a gathering. Yeah. It meant being together in person. And I think that's something I hadn't thought about until the pandemic. I started going, maybe this is an important aspect. Whatever the other things look like, being together in person. I'm not saying you can never do church online, but there's something about, 2 or 3 gathered in my name.
Yeah.
That you don't get sitting in a living room. And I think it'd be interesting to talk about that.
Yeah.
Because I joked from the pulpit a couple weeks ago, for one thing, on virtual church, no one tells you your breath stinks, right? They don't know. And if I don't like what's being preached, I just turn it off. I mean, there's a lot of aspects to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, so I think there's something about being gathered together. There's something about being in person that at least right now just cannot be replicated digitally. Maybe there's some future reality where we all have VR goggles on and the digital experience is literally identical from the to the in-person experience. I don't know. We're not there yet. Do you remember though, when in kind of the craze of that, the cutting edge church commentary people, the people who have newsletters to sell you things, they were all saying like, there is no normal again. It's going to be totally new, right?
Yep.
We're never going to go back. It's going to be completely different. If you're not investing in digital resources right now to continue a digital congregation from now on till forever, like you're going to be behind the curve forever. And I just really, I bought it a little bit and I still do. I buy this. The new normal is never going to look identical to the old normal.
Right.
But this is the thing that I threw out in a staff meeting recently, and it sounds kind of bold and courageous to say this. I don't think it is, but my call out on the future right now is that I think the future is going to be much more similar to the past. Specifically, like 2022 is going to look much more similar to 2018 than it is different than 2018. There's going to be differences. We're always going to have a bigger online congregation, online presence, I should say, not a separate congregation, but we're always going to have a bigger online presence than we had before. Post-COVID.
For sure.
But it is not like half of our church is going to only engage with us online because that's just easily replaced everything that was happening when we gathered together in person. That's just not going to happen.
I think you're right, but I think a really interesting question to ask is, what exactly do we lose by not being together in person?
Yeah.
I feel like that is the question of the hour for us right now.
Well, that's huge. Why are we instructed to not give up meeting together? And that's one of the things when that verse is thrown around left and right, nobody really talks about that, but it's actually in the context of the passage that you read, right?
Yeah.
I mean, 24 says what we're doing. Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. So that's one of the things we do when we gather together. So we're not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. And what I see happening here is the author of Hebrews is leaning into this huge tradition of the New Testament, which is describing the way the body of Christ works together in, I think, typically called the one another statements.
Yeah.
Right? How we love each other, love one another, encourage one another, serve one another. I mean, there's probably 10 to 15 of those different kinds of one another statements in the New Testament. And that's exactly what's called out here in Hebrews 10. And I do think that is what was missing. Like, if all you're doing is watching a sermon, and even let's just give you the benefit of the doubt, say you're participating in the worship songs, that you're not just sitting there listening to it, watching it on the screen, but you're actually singing. Even if that's happening, what's not happening digitally is any of the one another's. And am I putting my finger on it there?
Absolutely. I mean, I got a little analogy to this the other day. I was talking to a lady who's a therapist. Mm-hmm. She's a counselor, and she was talking about, and maybe you've run across this, a lot of people had to do, online or digital counseling. They counseled over Zoom. There was a lot of mental illness over COVID. But she said, I found people weren't willing to put up with it.
Yeah.
And she said the reason why wasn't that I couldn't talk to their problems or even give them sympathy. She said, when somebody cries, they want to be able to look somebody else in the eye.
Yeah.
And that's just one angle on it, but I thought that is so profound. I don't want to cry looking at a screen. I want somebody to put a hand on my, shoulder and say, it's going to be all right.
Yeah.
That's one angle on it.
There's something about being embodied, about being physical beings. And I think there's just something about the way God wired us to need that. I do think, though, for me, my takeaway of what I've learned from COVID is actually not that digital is bad or like that,
right.
Screens are worthless. Let's burn them in a pile. It's not that, but it's that if you don't have that connection to God's family, if you don't have the people that you're encouraging, that you're serving with, that you're loving, that are doing the same for you, that are praying with you, that know your life, and if that's missing, then you really are missing out on church. And for me, what I think is so important that people get about that is that's true whether you're watching church on a screen or whether you're there in person.
That's very fair.
I mean, that's one of the things that it's been kind of funny to me about one particular crowd in this conversation who has, pushed so hard that the church has to have its doors open to in-person worship or else it's being unfaithful. That if you don't get your people into the room to hear the sermon and to sing the songs, that you are violating the scriptures, but who don't have that same passion about actually being in a relationship with your church. That
once they're there,
right?
Yeah.
Like that somehow it's enough to just park your car, walk in quietly into the big room, find a seat where you're sitting forward, sit for 60 minutes where there's some singing and some teaching, and then walk back out of your car and drive home. And if that's all you do, that you're fulfilling the scriptures teaching in Hebrews 10, when in reality, that is not the case in any stretch. Like if you're not doing the spurring on, if you're not doing the encouraging, if you're not doing the serving and the praying, then even if you're there in person, you're not actually fulfilling what the intent of the scriptures are when it talks about the importance of gathering together.
That's actually a great point. I hadn't even thought about this before, but when we looked at this is all one sentence, verse 24 and 25. It's one thought. It's not just gather together. It's gather, like you said, and spur and encourage. It has to all work together to be the church.
Yeah. And that's where I'm totally comfortable with using some of the digital tools that we've had. I'm so glad that our life groups had Zoom. I know we all hate Zoom and we all got tired of it, and nobody wants to go back to it really. But I'm grateful that for a season I could continue to hear from the people in my life group what they needed prayer for. We can continue to study the word together. We can continue to even just pray together on Zoom. Like that, I think that was a huge gift.
How about those moments though in life group on Zoom when somebody's like, guys, I have something huge to share with you, and then their toddler comes running from the room with their diaper at their knees.
There were challenges.
There were definitely some challenges, but you're right. I wouldn't get rid of it. It's an incredible tool, but it was almost that much more frustrating. I mean, we found that in our life group. We just got to the point where it was almost a downer. Some of it was technology, somebody's connection's lousy or whatever, but some of it was just like, I'm talking to you, I'm sharing my heart right now, and you're on a screen.
Yeah.
So you're right. It's a tension. I think people are coming out of this though going, maybe I see the value a lot more than I did of being together in person than I did before. And hopefully that includes the relational part.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and that's where my goal, my hope for our church, and if you're at a church somewhere going through the same thing, I mean, my encouragement to you would be, don't misunderstand what was missing. Don't think that what was missing was being in the auditorium, and as soon as you get back there, that'll fix it all. It won't. Like, church was always supposed to be more than a big room filled with 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 people, where we could just hear teaching and sing together. That has never been the idea of church, of ecclesia. And to me, it's a little bit, it's encouraging and it's challenging at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. It means that the bar is a little higher than just showing up to church on Sunday morning. But it's encouraging too, because I actually wonder if there's some people who have shown up back to church, but are still feeling a little empty. Or, there was this excitement to be back in person.
Yeah.
But now, having been back a little bit, there's still this sense that something's lacking.
Yeah.
And
to use political terms, it was a one-issue platform. I just wanted to get back. You make a great point. You sound like a senior pastor or something.
Wow, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, that's because I hadn't thought about that. I was maybe one of those who found myself 8-10 months in just clamoring like, I don't care. I just want to get back. Yeah. And you're right. It's not enough to just be back if all that means is I sit there and take in content like I was doing in my living room.
Totally. Yep, totally. I mean, I thought that when it came to teaching, the move to online, you didn't lose much honestly. I consume a lot of teaching via podcast, via screen. It's pretty good. I mean, sometimes better. Like on the screen, you typically are getting a pretty close up of whoever's speaking's face. You can see facial expression a lot better than if you're in the 30th row of an auditorium. So that isn't going to be the thing that changes it. If you go from watching a sermon on a screen to watching a person in a room, it's going to be the relationships that you pour into. It's going to be the actual life on life, following Jesus together. Like that is the church at play. That's what you've been missing. And that's what we need as we get back.
Yeah. I heard somebody put it this way, it was a reminder that church is more than content.
Yeah.
Good content's important, but it's a lot more than just content. I love that as you have formulated your vision for the church, connect, grow, go. Connect comes first. And I don't know if that was intentional on your part, if it just flowed better off your tongue, but I think it does come first, but it can't stand alone.
Correct.
And so we're pushing this idea of connecting.
Yeah. Well, even connect, I mean, it comes first. I think even the move from not being saved to being saved is a connection. That is saying yes to adoption into the family of God. That's the first connection with God's family. And I think sometimes that happens relationally much more than it happens through a sermon or through teaching. It happens through the church, being the church, Christians coming alongside somebody and, building a relationship with somebody who doesn't know Jesus, and that person getting to see the life of somebody who's committed to Jesus.
Yeah.
And, that connection often I think is what draws people to receive the gospel in the first place. So,
loving someone into the kingdom. I've heard it put that way.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
There's something to that.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to circle back to this idea of what we learned from Code for the Church, and let's tie it into the name of this podcast, Native Exiles. Native Exiles. It's going to be famous one day. You were here first. Because it really is hand in hand with the concept of living as exiles. And that's maybe a new concept for some people to think about, but it's a very biblical idea that the community of followers of Jesus are exiles in the same way that Israel were exiles when they lived in Babylon. If you're a follower of Jesus, you are a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, but you're living in a different kingdom. You're living in the kingdom of the world.
Right.
And one of the things that you'll observe about exile communities, certainly true of Israel in Babylon, but even just today, if you look at communities of expats, of people who, are from another country but have moved to America or vice versa.
I know a little bit about
you
that.
Might. You do mission stuff here, don't you?
I'm a missionary kid, so I know the expat community and also the immigrants who come here. And one of the things that stands out, I think, where you're going with this is you retain certain aspects of your identity by getting together with those people that are still like you.
You keep that community.
You keep it.
And you have to, because the tide of the culture that you're in is overwhelming. It's so strong.
You're no longer an exile. Otherwise, you're just absorbed into the culture.
You're assimilated. Not necessarily a bad thing when
Nope.
we're talking about America or other nations. But when you're talking about following Jesus, being assimilated into the kingdom of the world is not a great thing, right? So if we want lives that resemble the kingdom of God, the kingdom that we're exiled from, and not the kingdom of the world, the kingdom that we're living in, that we're actually native to, then you have to have the connection with that community. And I mean, just to put some flesh on this, if you look at Christians who isolate themselves from church, and I know many Christians who wouldn't say they've walked away from their faith, wouldn't say they walked away from their Lord, but they've walked away from their church. They've walked away from church in general. And it is, I think, almost impossible to maintain a life that looks like Jesus without that community.
Community.
Yeah.
That's the key word.
And just the culture we're in is so alluring. It is so drawing. I mean, the temptation to just find your meaning and joy in life in the latest Netflix series, in the best restaurant that just moved into town, in that second drink, third drink, fourth drink, and we're at this level of wealth in America right now. And I know not everybody's wealthy, but our nation in general is wealthy enough that by and large, we can kind of afford to go pursue whatever we want to pursue. If it's food, drink, vacation, entertainment,
lots
whatever.
of distractions.
I one of the examples I used to think about the way that money changes the way the culture can draw on us is, the idea of being addicted to entertainment, which is kind of almost the norm today.
Right.
I don't know anybody who's not watching at least a few hours of television a week. But that just was never on the table until really pretty recently in human history.
I can vouch for that.
Okay. I mean, even in your life, it was
Yeah.
much harder, right? You had to find something good on television.
Right. I got a few decades on you. And back in the day when we had 3 channels and a couple, VHF channels, there wasn't much to choose from.
I mean, think about going back in time even further. Think about like living in the 1800s. And for you to be addicted to entertainment, one, you had to be incredibly wealthy. You also had to get in your horse and buggy and go to the theater every night. Like,
right.
It wasn't possible. Like the availability wasn't there. And we live in a culture today that whatever you might want to pursue, it's there. And it's pretty cheap, and probably it's within your grasp, and people who have it.
Yep. But there's that other aspect to it too. If it might not just be distraction or entertainment, it's my political identity. It's my causes. It's my passions. I can bury myself in those things and pull myself away from the community of believers that is meant to define me, give me my identity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So COVID forced a lot of us into that isolation, and that made things really tricky. It wasn't even a willful choice. We had to be isolated for a while. It was tough.
It did. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest changes that I think happened to the church. And I think it's not just Alderwood, but I think it's beyond. One of the things that I think COVID did is, in large part, it kind of put the final nail in the coffin of the category of the cultural Christian. The Christian who isn't, and I probably wouldn't even say this person is a Christian, but the person who came to church every once in a while because it was kind of something that their family did, their parents did before them. It was what, in their mind, good people do, but weren't really committed to the gospel, weren't committed to Christ. I think that if you weren't willing for Jesus to shape your life, that when church got shut down, you realized that nothing really changed. Like the church wasn't actually doing anything for you. I think those people just are not coming back. I think it's going to be true that the only people who are part of church are people who want to live as exiles, as people who have a different set of values in the world around them, a different heritage in the world around them, and they need people who share that to be able to continue it.
But I think one of the things, and maybe we could do another podcast on this, that COVID revealed was there are plenty of people who are happy to pull away from the community of Christians and believers, but still identify as Christians. And so they'll invoke Christian things to justify their political views, to justify their social actions. And so we would say they're, cultural Christians, and now they're not part of the community. But they would say, no, I'm every bit a Christian as you are. I don't have to go to church to be a Christian.
Totally.
There's a whole new community out there that doesn't identify with the community.
Yeah, and that's where I think a passage like Hebrews 10, and really, I mean, honestly, just the whole New Testament. When you read what Jesus is doing in his ministry, when you read the New Testament talk about what it means to be a Christian, it is just almost on every page. There is a people that has been called together to be the people of God, the church, the kingdom of God. That is the New Testament vision for people who follow Jesus together. And while it's true that anybody can redefine something if they want to, and people can take the label of Christian, people can take the label of evangelical, even if they want to, and do things with it. If we care about being people who follow the Jesus of the Bible, the Jesus of the New Testament, and we actually care to look at what Jesus was trying to do, we're going to see that there just is no church in the New Testament that isn't a group together in community, a family following Jesus. There is no other vision.
You said something last week in your sermon on connecting that really jumped out at me, which was there's no way to become more like Jesus unless you're around people that belong to Jesus.
If you want more of Jesus in your life, you need more of Jesus' family in your life.
And man, that was really a succinct way to say it, but it's totally true.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Well, hey, we need to wrap this up. One of the things I'm really excited about is our next conversation, which will come out in a couple weeks, about what COVID revealed about us. And we're going to get into all kinds of fun things there, politics for sure. I think I want to talk a little bit about some of the increasing anxiety, depression epidemic that we're experiencing right now.
It's huge.
Some of that. And so that's going to be a good conversation as well. But Steve, maybe you can just close this here. Somebody is listening to this right now. They haven't been back to church yet. They're not connected to God's people. And maybe they're frustrated by this conversation, but maybe the Lord is putting something in their heart. Would you just pastor them for a second, give them a word as we wrap this thing up?
Yeah, I mean, so many of us have been hurt by the church. You can't be around the church and not be hurt by the church on some level. There's no perfect church out there. But that call to just be with God's people. Say it again. Say that phrase one more time. If you want
more of Jesus in your life, then you need more of Jesus' family in your life.
That's where Jesus is at. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name. And I'm excited about what the future holds for us. We've seen some warts in ourselves as a church. We're confessing those. We're confronting those. I think we'll talk more about that. By the way, you and I agreed way too much this week.
Okay, yeah, we'll disagree more next time.
People are paying the big bucks to see how smart you are and for you to just destroy all my statements. But we long to be back together with the body of Christ.
Yeah, not just on Sunday morning, but in our life groups and the teams we serve with, in the Bible studies, the classes we do, even just in each other's living rooms, just loving each other. And we would love for you to be a part of that, either here or at whatever church God has called you to.
Absolutely.
So, Steve, thanks. This was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Native Exiles. And if you like the show, one of the ways you can support us is by following us wherever you're listening to this podcast, or subscribe on YouTube if you're watching that version of it. But really, the biggest thing you can do is tell a friend, share this with somebody, and spread the word a little bit. And if you want to submit a question for us to answer in future shows, which we're going to have a few of these where we can answer questions from our audience, you can click on the link in our show notes right now. That'll take you to a spot to be able to record your question. You can ask it. You might end up on a podcast yourself, and we'd be happy to dive into whatever God has put on your mind about theology, about the scriptures, about the church, about Jesus, whatever it is. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening in, and we'll see you next time.